We have a most interesting panel today on the collapse of the Soviet Union, one of the most difficult and fraught and interesting topics, and one of the, for me, least favorable events in history. But that's just my own prejudice about these things. I'm going to introduce all of the people right now. Maybe I'll save Anatol to a bit later when he arrives. Our first speaker is going to be Sheila Fitzpatrick, who you know, who has not only written on all aspects of the Soviet Union, particularly on Stalinism, but recently a book on the death of Stalin, even, which will come out soon. And so her thoughts will be interesting on the end of the Soviet Union, which she also experienced. The next speaker will be Dr. Svetlana Savranskaya of the National Security Archive, one of the most interesting and important institutions we have that collects and publishes documents about recent histories, particularly in our part of the world. That is the part of the world we're interested. She's a senior analyst at the archive, and since 2001, she is the director of the archive's Russia program. Svetlana has written and edited a number of books. The Last Superpower Summits, Reagan, Gorbachev, and Bush at the end of the Cold War, a book with Sergei, the late, sadly, Sergei Mikoyan on the Soviet-Cuban Missile Crisis, masterpieces of history with Dr. Zubov, one of the most interesting people on the end of the Soviet Union. I could go on and on. Her achievements have been numerous. Thirdly, we have Tom Graham right here to my right, not politically only, but physically. And he's a distinguished fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Recently, last fall, he published a book which is a kind of iconoclastic take on some of the United States' Russia policy, Getting Russia Right. He's also a co-founder of Yale University's Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies program. He has been a research fellow at Yale's Macmillan Center, and currently he's at the Council of Foreign Relations in New York. Anything else you want me to say about him? He's a terrific fellow, too.
You might want to mention that I work for the U.S. government.
He did work for the U.S. government. Yes, we can't help that. So, but you should buttonhole him sometime, capture him in a corner, and talk to him, because he's amazingly informative on all of these events. And our last speaker will be, and he will appear, is Anatol Lieven, who is related to another Lieven at this table, Dominique Lieven. He's a British author, journalist, and policy analyst. He's been visiting professor at King's College. He's the author of a wonderful book on American nationalism called America, Right or Wrong, which got him into a lot of trouble and even dismissed from the Carnegie Center in Washington. So he got another job now at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington. So he's back with us. I'm going to start then with Sheila Fitzpatrick.
How long? How many minutes?
10, can you do 10 or?
10?
Yeah.
Sure. Right. Collapse of the Soviet Union. It is actually strange to me to feel that it's now come within the purview of historians. We usually impose that sort of 30-year rule. But given that it is something one was around for, it's still a little strange for me to look at it historically. But I had to do that, writing that book, The Shortest History of the Soviet Union. And so I'll start off by recapitulating the way I started that book. I started it in 1980 with a preface on 1980, the point being that in 1980, nobody could have really imagined that the Soviet Union could collapse. On the contrary, it was just at that time that the political scientists who for decades had in various ways been talking about the ways in which it might collapse, decided that in fact it was stable. It was there for the long term. One had to accept that. And Severin Biala, who is my friend of mine and a colleague at Columbia, he wrote a book about basically putting forward this thesis: the Soviet Union is stable, it's going to be around, and we should simply accept that and stop being silly and pretending it's not going to be. And there was then a conference of political scientists shortly after in 1980, in which all of them from, not everybody obviously, but people from different corners of Sovietology said, yes, indeed, yeah, it's stable, it's going to be around. And of course, within 11 years, it wasn't around. The other thing I put into the book, because I couldn't resist it, it seemed to me such a nice irony. You probably don't remember, many of you, that there used to be, in libraries, there would be cards. The catalogues were card catalogues. They were cards, you know, small oblongs with things written on them. In the Library of Congress, the main US the Library of Reference, there had been, as in all the other major libraries, there was no entry for the Soviet Union or Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. There was no entry for that. The entry instead was Russia, 1923 on. And that was the result of pressure, I suppose, from emigre groups, or perhaps it must have been emigre pressure, I think. But a lack of willingness to recognize that the Soviet Union had legitimately arrived on the earth. Now, it was just about 1980 that Jim Billington was, I think, about to become Librarian of Congress. He was a Russian historian. And he circularized other Russian historians to say, it's really stupid, isn't it, that there's no entry for the Soviet Union? And we all wrote back and said, yes, really stupid, let's have a card category entry for the Soviet Union. And so indeed, one was started, and same story. Just 11 more years or maybe 10 actually, of publication under that heading. So you've heard me, those of you who've been around for the past week, heard me talking about contingency as against закономерность. I am very wary of the notion that if something really big happens, it must have a really big, clear cause. I feel contingency is extremely important. Always, actually. I mean, I feel this in principle. Which I would be happy to argue, but you probably don't want to argue that. But all the more do I feel it in relation to the collapse of the Soviet Union, which means that my approach to it, in trying to describe it in the book, was emphasizing contingency, which made it, as I reread it, it made it too detailed on the events of perestroika, but never mind. However, having said that, I'm not going really to talk I'm not going really to analyze the contingencies, the important contingencies that led to the collapse. Obviously, if you're taking this approach, you're looking at perestroika and what was it in there that caused things to unravel, and there's the other line of approach would be about the seriousness of Soviet economic problems and exactly how they contributed. But I'm not going to go there. I'm going to just briefly draw your attention to the way in which the Soviet Union collapsed, the way in which it unraveled, which was, I think, and this is a little bit against my contingency argument, well, no, not really, but the way in which it unraveled was related, of course, to the structure, the historical structure that existed. And I would here single out the extensive powers of Republican and regional first secretaries. This was something that, because we were fascinated by central power in the Soviet Union, there was relatively a little discussion of regional, well, it was Jerry Huff's Soviet prefects early on, but when we were talking about power, it was usually centrally focused. When you look closer, you would see, of course, discussions of little Stalins out in the provinces, but that not a great deal of attention was paid to that. But when you actually look at the functioning from throughout the Soviet system, but let's focus just on the Khrushchev to Brezhnev on period, one sees very extensive powers of the people running regions and republics. And this is analyzed in a very good recent book by Yoram Golitsky and Oleg Klivnyuk, Sub-State Dictatorships. I don't know whether you know it. Anyway, it's very well worth reading. Now, what happened in the course of the unraveling, you had these very powerful Republican first secretaries. In the course of the unraveling, they mainly transitioned themselves into presidents of, especially of the national republics, popularly elected presidents, which of course gives a stronger mandate. And that, in my mind, is the circumstance, because you have these powerful leaders of republics. That is the circumstance that made it possible for it to fall apart so easily. In other words, the formerly Soviet, now about to be post-Soviet leaders of the republic, leading their republics out to a condition of sovereign statehood. And I think that's worth, in a way, this seems to be a sort of technical matter, but I think it's worth emphasizing, because now that the discourse has very firmly identified the Soviet Union as an empire, and an empire which unraveled. The presumption about an empire that unraveled is that over time popular unrest grew in the national areas subordinate to the Russian metropolis. Over time, popular unrest grew, and finally that caused the whole thing to destruct. And I think that is not the picture that really applies. It's a picture that could apply well to the Baltics. And the Georgian case, people who know it better should argue it. But overall, you have, of course, popular movements, but not, it seems to me, strong enough to produce the result. The result of disintegration was able to be produced because of the structure of regional power, which we can trace going back to the 1920s. And that, of course, means that that's important also for the post-Soviet situation, in that in a number of the newly separate countries, you're not building on a very strong sense of national identity. The task is to create it to suit the new circumstances. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Sheila. Svetlana.
Thank you very much to the organizers, to Anna, to Diana for supporting this, for inviting me and Tom to this conference. It's a very special event for me, because I myself organized similar summer institutes for several years, and I think this was the best and most meaningful thing that I've done at the archive. I also would like to add a little bit to the introduction. When Professor Suny introduced me, he mentioned that I wrote the book, The Last Superpower Summits. This was co-authored with my husband, Tom Blanton. I could not have done it without him. But a lot of that book is focused on how the Soviet Union ended. And of course, you know, we have 10 minutes, so I will try to collapse all I want to say, but Sheila really helped me here with one aspect that I wanted to talk about: the way the regional power structures worked at the end of the Soviet Union, the way first secretaries in every republic, rather than being concerned with democratization or really grassroots popular movements, were going after personal power and consolidating their personal power in the republics. And the things that often in the West were seen as this genuine nationalist rise of authentic movements in the republics were really efforts to consolidate personal power and efforts to co-opt these genuine nationalist movements under the existing power structures with changing the names of the institutions. So in the 10 minutes that I have, I would like to make a couple of points, and hopefully we will be able to talk about them in a question and answer session. So first of all, I would like to say that the West did not break the Soviet Union. The West did not try to break it up and did not succeed because it did not try. Then I am going to ask the question, so who broke up the Soviet Union? And my answer would be not the nationalist movements, not the Republican Democratic uprisings, but it actually was Russia with the help of Ukraine, and we're putting Baltics aside as a special different case, where in fact, as Sheila pointed out, there were true national democratic but more independent movements. And the third point I would like to make is, what were the alternatives? Was there any alternative to breakup of the Soviet Union? And my answer to this question is yes, there was an alternative of a loose confederation, voluntary confederation that would develop in a way of kind of a social democratic polity, and messy, of course, very hard to define the exact parameters of that, but it would be something like Gorbachev envisioned as this new union with the republics, those republics that were willing to participate in that new union. How democratic it would be? Probably not perfectly democratic, but moving in that direction. Okay, so these are the three main items that I would like to cover here. So first of all, let me talk about the West did not want to break up the Soviet Union. Of course, here I'm simplifying. I'm not talking about the entire West. But if you look especially at 1991, after the unification of Germany, you can see that the West saw a real partner in Gorbachev. Remember the concept of the common European home, where a new reformed democratic Soviet Union would be gradually integrated into Europe. Again, the forms of those processes were undefined. Gorbachev viewed it as possible expansion and development of CSC. There were different forms of NATO and Warsaw Pact developing alongside with each other, but then we know that Warsaw Pact, of course, dissolved. In this case, it was a genuine desire on the part of the members of the Warsaw Pact to get out from the control of the Soviet Union. There's no question about that. But some form of integration of a new reformed Soviet Union into Europe was actually something that the West liked as an idea. And by saying the West, I'm thinking primarily about the United States. At that time, the closest partner of the Soviet reformers. I'm thinking about France, Great Britain, Germany, of course, very strong and grateful ally of the Soviet Union in 1990-91, and Spain. And Spanish leadership was especially close to Gorbachev. So if you look at this moment in time, 1991, I totally agree with what Sheila mentioned as the contingency factor. We look back at this period and it seems to us that it was preordained, that it was inevitable, that the Soviet Union was going to break up. But if you look even at the CIA analysis throughout 1980s, until actually May, June 1991, that's when they start thinking the Soviet Union might collapse, and they see different ways of how it could happen. So the critical event here in 1991 is, of course, the August coup of 1991, when the conservatives decided that Gorbachev was detrimental to the cause of preservation of the Soviet Union. They decided to remove him. You could see immediately that all the leadership of the Western countries very strongly stood for Gorbachev. In the country itself, it was pretty questionable. The population was silent. Outside of Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Novosibirsk, somewhat, population was silent. Something that struck me recently when I was doing some research about it is that another silent city was Kiev. There were no demonstrations in Kiev in support of the democratic leadership in Russia. Striking on the one hand, not striking at all on the other hand, because the Ukrainians were very concerned about Russian nationalists and their claims on the Ukrainian territories. So the coup of 1991 certainly undermined Gorbachev's plans and the negotiations on the new Union Treaty and put the things in this precarious balance. And yet already in the fall of 1991, with Yeltsin gone to one of his state dachas, to Crimea, to rest, Gorbachev embarks on some kind of a fall offensive. He is full of initiatives. He talks to the West. He renews the negotiations on the Union Treaty. We don't have time to go into it, but I would like to mention, because I feel one of my roles here is to point you to the documents that exist on all these different subjects. So in Moscow, if you can get there, and somewhat in the United States, we now have full record of the presidential council, Russian presidential council, for the entire fall of 1991. These are verbatim records, and there is definitely a dissertation waiting to happen based on these very detailed discussions of what they were talking about actually was how to preserve, in what form to preserve a new union. So while these negotiations are going on, Kravchuk did not participate in those negotiations. Yeltsin did, but his behavior is very different. His behavior is of a person who is almost entitled to be a major leader, if not the most important leader. The most constructive person in those negotiations, in those discussions of the economic structures, political structures, is Nazarbayev, which is very interesting. Really, you know, the portrait of Nazarbayev that emerges from these records is quite incredible. Okay, so what is the West doing? The West is trying to support Gorbachev with everything they can at that moment. And a kind of wonderful reminder of how deeply and how cooperatively Gorbachev and the Soviet leadership were still involved that late in 1991 in global problems, how well they worked with the Western leaders, is the summit, the beginning of the conference on the Middle East, which took place in the end of October 1991 in Madrid. Records of that summit are also available from the Gorbachev Foundation. They're available on our website. And you can see in these conversations, they speak about it very openly, that the main leaders of Europe are completely supportive of Gorbachev's efforts to try to keep the Soviet Union together. And President Bush and Secretary of State Baker speak very supportively and trying to figure out how they can help, to the extent that they contact Yeltsin right on the eve of that conference and ask Yeltsin to tone down his major speech, in which, as soon as Gorbachev leaves the country, Yeltsin launches his new program, new economic program, and undermines all the central institutions, agencies, such as cutting by 90% the funding for the Soviet Foreign Ministry. So up until the last moment, the West is actually behind Gorbachev's project of keeping the Soviet Union together in a new form. Now, I will conclude here by saying that a lot of people now, looking back in the former Soviet Union, think that the United States had the goal to undermine, to break up the Soviet Union. It is not true, but it is not just not true. It is also very harmful. In 1992, President Bush decided to use this in his electoral rhetoric, and he said, we won the Cold War. He never said that before, but in 1992, he found it useful for his electoral purposes. Well, that point was immediately seized upon the Russian conservatives. And until now, you can still see in the Putin's grievances this idea that the West was sitting there waiting for the Soviet Union to collapse and was trying to do everything possible. That narrative is wrong and harmful and still hurts US-Russian relations today. Okay, I will not talk about who broke up the Soviet Union. We can address it in the question and answer. I will conclude my 10-15 minutes by saying there were alternatives. And what is the alternative? The alternative one that to me seemed at the time and seems now to have been possible was this loose new union. It would not be a Soviet Union, whatever name you give it. It would be a political entity which would be not a perfect but a liberal democracy, would be developing in that direction, and would be allied with the emerging European Union and with the United States. So what you would have is these three centers of power sharing the same values, having history of the last 6 years of very close cooperation on arms control, on resolving regional conflicts, and beginning to address climate change. Now, if that happened, we would be now in a very different situation. I know this is a very radical statement, but I would posit that if the Soviet Union changed in that way, we could have avoided deadly conflicts in Europe that we're experiencing now. Thank you.
Hello. I'm sorry to be arriving both late in general and late this morning. I just got in the middle of the night. I've been in Berlin and Paris covering things there for my institute. So forgive me also if I'm not totally coherent. I'll talk about, I covered the collapse of the Soviet Union and its aftermath as a journalist for the Times of London from the start of 1990 to the end of 1996. And so I thought perhaps I'd say something about, my perceptions of that. And a few things to start with. One, so often I found that what I saw on the ground was radically different from the way in which things were presented, actually in much of the Western media as well as later in academia. The other thing that struck me very strongly was there were occasions when I felt a bit like Pierre Bezukhov at Borodino, or Fabrizio Del Dongo, if you know the Charterhouse of Parma, at Waterloo. That's to say, stumbling around amidst immense confusion, with me having no idea really what was going on, but then nor did anyone else around me either, the local people. And then watching how this very confused picture was rendered into orderly, analysis, orderly developments in the subsequent writing. So that was rather interesting. This, by the way, in academic terms, gave me a quite violent prejudice against what in academia is called, I'm sorry to say approvingly, parsimonious explanations. That's to say that you find, one explanation for something that happened, some great event. I mean, to be honest, that for me translates into plain English as simplistic. There are very, very few major events in history, and certainly everything surrounding the collapse of the Soviet Union was not one of them, in which there is one simple explanation. I have to say as well that these parsimonious explanations often served both laziness, of course, unwillingness to look into some of these things in detail, and also prejudice, because you could find one explanation that served your own beliefs and feelings. Just to give one example, the idea that the first Chechen war was launched and continued for oil, that it was the desire of the Russian elites to get their hands on Chechen oil and then steal it for themselves, and the military elites. The people who put this forward had apparently not realized that there wasn't any oil left in Chechnya. It had all been taken, or very little. I mean, invading Azerbaijan would have been a better idea from that point of view.
A good idea.
Well, you have just come from Armenia, yes. A couple of other things. Quite unlike the great majority of the journalists, in fact, all the journalists that I knew, and of course the great majority of Western commentators, I came to the Soviet Union as it then was, not from the West, but from several years in different capacities, finally as a journalist with India and Pakistan and Afghanistan, covering South Asia. And this had two effects. One, all my colleagues saw the Soviet Union as a kind of economic and social disaster. I saw it as a relatively successful developmental state. They would go around complaining about police corruption. I would say, police corruption? Have you been in Bihar? They would complain about the health service. I would say, let me tell you about the Pakistani health service. They'd complain about the airlines. I would say, yes, let me tell you something about really bad airlines. And so it went. But this, I think, has a serious point behind it as well, which I shall return to, which is that in certain respects, despite the enormous, of course, disruption and changes of the 1990s, aspects of the Soviet Union turned out to be rather more resilient, in fact, than other societies faced with this kind of change. And finally, and previous speakers have alluded to this, the Soviet Union is now seen very much, this is the standard narrative, as an empire, as an imperial system. I'm not sure, though, that this has been, well, certainly not in the media, not in the think tank world to which I now belong, in academia perhaps. But the full conclusions of this have not been perhaps drawn. Coming from South Asia and from studies as a historian in other imperial areas, one thing that struck me, well, about the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, when it collapsed, and actually even for 30 years, 30 years? 40 years? 30 years after that, was how remarkably peaceful it was. When you look at the collapse of the British, the French, the Belgian, and then, of course, before that, the Austrian, the Turkish, the Spanish empires. I mean, what you see, of course, is the eruption of conflicts, whether conflicts that had long existed and were suppressed and held down by the empire, or conflicts that were, in fact, generated by things that the empire had done, often, above all, by moving people around. The other thing was that although it was peaceful at the time, remembering the fact that, for example, in Sri Lanka, the civil war, which was always to some extent inherent in the ethnic situation in Sri Lanka from the day of independence, only in fact broke out 30 years later. I always thought that the conflict's still waiting to happen, and indeed they now have happened. And although the fall of the Soviet Union was peaceful by the standards of previous empires, it hasn't stayed that way. Now, I have to say that when it comes to, I suppose perhaps not exactly an intellectual guide, but an imaginative guide to what happened in Russia and Ukraine in the 1990s, really after the fall of the Soviet Union, though as part of that whole process. And I wrote about this in a book that I wrote in 1997. In many ways, my guiding work was The Leopard by Lampedusa, about the fall of the Bourbon monarchy and system of southern Italy in the face of the combination of Italian nationalism, but then of the eruption of liberal economics and politics into that region. And some of this analogy really looks rather appropriate. The most famous remark in the Gattopardo is that of a younger prince from the old Bourbon aristocracy who explains to his uncle why he is joining the liberal revolutionaries. Because for everything to stay the same, in other words, for us to remain in charge, or at least me to remain in charge and to retain our land and our power, everything has to change. And that was very much the attitude of the younger members of the communist elite in several of these countries. And one saw this, of course, not just in the former Soviet Union, but across much of Eastern Europe as well, for them to remain in power. And of course, not just to remain in power, but vastly to enrich themselves. So this was, of course, in a way for them a much more revolutionary position than that of Tancredi, who just wanted to basically hang on to what he had. They had to adopt the whole new philosophy, policy, attitudes, systems. There's a new oligarchical entrepreneur in The Leopard, who I think also corresponds rather well to the new oligarchs who emerged in Russia and Ukraine and elsewhere in the 1990s. And finally, there is actually, I would say, much more honourable, with some exceptions. I include, for example, Jeff Sachs in that, than most of the Western advisors in Russia and Ukraine in the 1990s. Chevalier, who comes in as an advisor and emissary from northern Italy, from Piedmont, to bring reform and liberalism and progress to this area. The problem is that he understands absolutely nothing about Sicily and is therefore completely useless, in fact, when it comes to recommending change. But above all, it seemed to me there were some pretty close analogies between privatization in the former Soviet Union and the process by which liberal regimes and elites, not just in southern Italy, but in Spain, in France after the revolution, and in much of Latin America as well, seized upon and distributed church land and peasant, and in South America, Indio communal land, and distributed this to, well, the idea was that much of it was going to the peasants themselves. In fact, to a very great extent, in fact, overwhelming extent, it went to new liberal capitalist landowners, commercial landowners, closely linked to or coming from the new political elites. So in both cases, an extremely corrupt process, which also had a disastrous impact on the people themselves. Now, when I stress the bad results of all this, you understand, I'm not saying that the old systems were necessarily good. I am defending neither Aztec human sacrifice nor the Soviet consumer industry. Perhaps not quite as well, I mean, the great thing about the Aztecs, of course, was the process was short, whereas queuing in the Soviet Union was very, very, very long, as some of you will remember. So you takes your choice. However, I mean, what I think you did see in this period was something with very old and widespread pattern, which was the eruption of modern, well, or even actually to a degree pre-modern, if you go back to Columbus and Vasco da Gama, capitalist economics into previously closed economic and political systems. Now, once again, the Soviet Union was not as far from the West, perhaps, certainly not in terms of industrialization, sheer industrialization and science and other things, as other systems of this kind. But nonetheless, I think you can see a common pattern here, whereby you had this wrecking ball. But this wrecking ball, of course, covered with wonderful slogans about freedom and progress and development and democracy, which came in and smashed this previous system. In a system where unlike, shall we say, in France after the revolution, the elements of that would successfully and in a stable and orderly manner be able to adapt to this new system were to a considerable extent lacking. Though, as I say, not as lacking perhaps as we thought. Two other factors here, if you look at the wider history of liberal capitalism erupting into these regions. One is the comprador element. Here I think you could see particularly some very close analogies between somewhere like Argentina from the later 19th century on, and Russia and Ukraine. That's to say that a class emerged which basically existed to extract resources, in those cases largely agricultural, but of course in so much of the world mineral, and in Russia, in Ukraine mineral, in Russia mineral, but also above all energy, to extract resources from the areas that they had seized control of, and to a very considerable extent transfer them to the economic metropolises of the West, where to a great extent they moved. One of the ironies of the Falklands War was that the old Argentine elites were profoundly Anglophile. They lived much of their time in London. They bought property there. They sent their children to English schools to be educated, very like in many ways the new business elites of Russia and Ukraine from the 1990s on. And then you see the various attempts, successful or unsuccessful, to push back against this at various levels. At the popular level, I think, although of course this goes back to revolts against, forms of protest against the old regimes as well. But I think that Hobsbawm's book on social banditry is well worth reading from this point of view. The way in which traditional peasant societies push back against attempts radically to change them from outside, coupled with large levels of exploitation and corruption. And of course, very often this takes a criminal form. One of the results of the eruption of liberalism into southern Italy was a colossal growth of the Italian mafia, and its analogies outside Sicily, as local communities found ways through armed force of resisting some of the things that were done to them. I suppose I don't know enough about Mexico to say whether this has any validity, but you could, I suppose, see the drugs organizations in Mexico as a continuation of various forms of India resistance going back many hundreds of years. Oh, by the way, just one thing to slip in. Of course, the West, while preaching development, was, of course, absolutely, well, not actually the West in general, but certainly Western banks and elites in this process, because, of course, it was through them that these resources, or the profits of these resources, were extracted from Russia and Ukraine and other places and transferred through money laundering, which we euphemized as capital flight, to Western banks, real estate, luxury goods in the West. Not that this benefited the mass of the population. I was, a few years ago, when I was covering Pakistan, I was asked by the British Aid Agency to testify in defense of aid to Pakistan from Britain to the House of Commons. And finally, and of course the questions were all about corruption. And I was sort of driven back, and finally I said, look, let's be honest, at which point all the British officials around the table started shaking. And I said, you know, one thing is, of course, we are buying influence in Pakistan. But the other thing is that actually overall we're not losing anything, because the money that's stolen by Pakistani politicians and officials comes right back to London in the form of shopping at Harrods, you know, and buying real estate in Knightsbridge and Hampstead. Well, from the back, this Conservative woman MP stood up and said in this strong Midlands accent, "That wouldn't impress my constituents very much. I'm from Birmingham." I couldn't really say anything about that. This process has benefited the masses of the West as little, in a way. Well, it hasn't harmed us as much, but it certainly benefited us as little. And of course, it's also contributed to the corruption of Western elites, which is now such a theme in our own societies. But finally, oh yes, I mean, the other thing was here, and this is of such importance, and we see it in our own societies as well now. It's become apparent once again. But the contempt for the former Soviet masses, of course, expressed not just by the Westerners coming in, but also by those Russian and Ukrainian metropolitan liberals who identified wholly with this, verged on the racist. I mean, sometimes it echoed almost word for word the phrases used by North Italians about Sicily and southern Italy in the 1860s and 70s, and used in South America, there, of course, with an explicitly racist content about the masses, the non-white masses in South America. And then you see the attempt by states or state elites, or state security elites sometimes, to push back against this. Now this, of course, just as popular resistance is as diverse as the societies to which these things happen, so of course is state resistance. But what I think you have seen under Putin is an attempt to create a deeply corrupt, of course, thieving, if you like, state economic oligarchy, but which stays in Russia and keeps its money in Russia, and coming to a great extent from the former security elites, identifies itself with the state, if only because if the state falls, so will they, which was not true of the oligarchs in the 1990s. Of course, we now see this in full flower, not so much because of Putin, what Putin has done, but because of what we have done. Western sanctions have actually forced a lot of people to take their money back to Russia and to stay there. And if anyone was interested at some stage, I was in Moscow a few weeks ago talking to the security elites and others, and as one Russian businessman said to me, I know that the Russian government is going to steal a large part of their money, but at least they're going to spend it for Russia on the war. Whereas, you know, if I kept it in the West, I'd risk losing everything. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final panelist, Tom Graham.
Thank you very much, Ron. It's difficult to follow these three speakers. In particular, since I was just informed this morning that I'm going to speak on this panel. Let me just start by saying that I spent the last years of the Soviet Union actually working at the American Embassy in Moscow, from 1987 to 1990, And then I switched back to Washington, where I worked at the Pentagon from 1990 to 1992. So my professional career hasn't been spent in academia. It hasn't been spent as a journalist. I've spent mostly in the policymaking world. And that's a different world from the academic world. I think academics, rightfully, when they look at events, say they're complex. There are a lot of different factors that produce the outcomes that you see. In the policymaking world, we really don't like complexity, in part because the goal of policymaking is to act. And if it's too complex, it's very difficult to decide what it is you're supposed to do. So you have to simplify to a certain degree in order to be able to develop and formulate policies that you're going to act on. Again, the goal in the policymaking world is not to understand what's happening so much, it's actually to change the way the world operates to the advantage of the United States, if that's the government you're working for. I am thankful that, that Sheila mentioned Søren Bialer, because he had a very important impact on me when I was working at the embassy in Moscow. I remember spending one Saturday morning reading his book on the Soviet paradox, external expansion, internal decline, and especially his chapter on why the Soviet Union was stable, and going through each of the points that he was making and saying, that's not true, that's not true, that's not true, that's not true, that's not true. And that's the moment in which I realized that the Soviet Union really was falling apart. I think if you go back and look at the reporting that the embassy did out of Moscow in the late 1980s, you'll see that we had a very strong sense starting in 1998. The breakup of the Soviet Union was a very likely scenario. Now, I think one thing that's unfortunate about the archival material is that most of that focuses on what is done in Washington, right? That pertains to the Lithuanian independence movement, Sąjūdis. If you remember, at the Congress of People's Deputies, elected in 1989, the delegation from Lithuania was composed almost of Sąjūdis members, the Popular Front, the group that wanted to see the restoration of Lithuanian independence. And one of the first things they did after they arrived in Moscow is ask for a meeting with the American ambassador. And at the meeting with the American ambassador, they then laid out their plan over the next year that would lead to the restoration of Lithuanian independence. And as all good embassies, we dutifully reported back to Washington that Sąjūdis was here. Here are this is the 6 or 7 point plan to the restoration of independence. And over in the succeeding months, we maintained the contact with the Sąjūdis members as they came to Moscow for various events. There was some travel to the region as well. And we dutifully reported each of the steps they were taking in order to restore independence. Now, the Republican parliamentary elections were held in the spring of 1990, if I get the dates right, remember the dates correctly. And Sąjūdis voted overwhelmingly in that election. The Sąjūdis was supposed to, the parliament, the Seimas was supposed to meet on March 11th, and the first act that Sąjūdis was going to propose was the restoration of Lithuanian independence. On March 10th, we got a cable from Washington that says, do you think these people are serious about declaring a restoration of independence? And what we did was we listed the 24 or so cables that we had sent back on this and simply said, see refs, period, and sent that cable back to Washington. And of course, Lithuania did declare the restoration of independence. And then we had to deal with that and, in fact, did whatever we could to avoid actually recognizing them, despite the fact that we had had a 50-year policy of non-recognition of the incorporation of the Baltic states into the Soviet Union. This gets to a point that Svetlana made about the position of the other Western governments. Certainly the United States at that point, at the highest levels, did not want to see the breakup of the Soviet Union, in large part because President Bush thought that he was working quite closely with with Mikhail Gorbachev at that point on a whole range of issues that were advantageous to the United States. Arms control agreements. We saw the peaceful withdrawal of Soviet forces from East Central Europe in 1989. There was a reform movement of some sort ongoing in the Soviet Union that we thought would be advantageous to the United States. And so we were quite happy working with Gorbachev and saw a reformed Soviet Union as advantageous to the United States over the long term, as opposed to the breakup of the country and all the difficulties that would bring with it, not the least of which was the control of the weapons of mass destruction, particularly nuclear weapons, and having those spread across 15 different new independent states with no reliable control was a nightmare for the United States. Now, just as a footnote say, in some ways this is ironic, because if you look at what the policy of the United States was during the latter stages of the Cold War until Gorbachev, in fact, what we were trying to figure out is how we could break up the Soviet Union, looking at the various, or looking for elements of tension within the Soviet society. Nationalities movements was always a big issue. Is there potential for potent nationalist movements in the Union republics that will undermine the strength of the Soviet Union and lead to its breakup? When we actually get close to that in the real time, the policy of the United States shifts for different reasons. Now, I think we looked at this from the embassy in Moscow, and I think this is something that is ultimately realized back in Washington, is that the real challenge to the integrity of the Soviet Union doesn't come from the various nationalist movements. It's something I think you mentioned, Sheila, you as well, Svetlana. It really is the struggle between Yeltsin and Gorbachev, which in many ways is a struggle of Russia against Russia. Yeltsin and trying to base his power on the Russian Republic at that point as a way of displacing Gorbachev in Moscow. I think if you look at the record and what Yeltsin was saying at that point, he was willing to push for or support for various nationalist movements, certainly in the Baltic states, the South Caucasus. Ukraine is always sort of a sore point there. But the idea was that if we can break up the Soviet Union, I can assume the seat in Moscow. And then by a natural process, the resurrection of Russia on the basis of a more effective economic system will gradually bring all these countries back together under the aegis of Russia. And so we're not talking about a permanent breakup of the Soviet Union. We're talking about a breakup of the Soviet Union as a tactic to gain power, and after which we will then begin the process of trying to rebuild the Russian Empire or the Russian state on a different basis. Ukraine turns out to be the problem in all of that, because the Ukraine, as it turns out, actually did want independence. And they pursued, I think, very much a course focused on that throughout the 1989, 1990 into 1991. And Kravchuk, the president of Ukraine at that point, was probably at least as important in Yeltsin in leading to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, in part because of his refusal to participate in these various discussions of a new union treaty or a confederation of some sort. Final point, and I'll stop on this, is though although it's clear that at the presidential level in the United States, there was a desire to see the Soviet Union hold together. That wasn't actually true throughout the U.S. government at that point. In fact, if you looked at particularly the upper levels of the Central Intelligence Agency, the upper levels of the Department of Defense, where I worked at that point, there was very much a desire to see whether the United States could pursue a policy that would lead to the breakup of the Soviet Union. The CIA, despite the fact that it exceeded its mandate, actually ran something of a covert operation inside the United States, building up Yeltsin as a counterweight to Gorbachev, very much making the argument, by the way it briefed people in the press, some of the things that it sent downtown in forms of analysis, trying to push U.S. policy away from Gorbachev to more formal support for Yeltsin. Within the Department of Defense, that same sort of attitude. In fact, Secretary of Defense Cheney gave Yeltsin something of the royal treatment when he came to visit the Pentagon on one of his visits to the United States in, I think, 1991 it would have been, and a much more pompous sort of reception than he got from at the White House at that point. The Pentagon was also much more supportive of Ukrainian independence at that point. So if President Bush goes to Kiev and talks about the dangers of nationalism in what came to be known as his Chicken Kiev speech, the Pentagon at that point was pushing very energetically for more support for Ukraine, supporting the breakup. And in fact, one of the not telegrams, but in the memorandums I wrote for distribution in the interagency community in the fall of 1991 was the case for Ukrainian independence and why this would be good for the United States. Beyond that, we were also thinking inside the Pentagon of how you could ensure that the breakup proceeded beyond simply the constituent republics, actually to various elements or segments of the Russian Federation itself. So yes, at the highest levels, the president, support for Gorbachev and the continuing integrity of the Soviet Union, but within the U.S. government, a very active debate and actually a campaign to try to shift policy away from that to support for the breakup of the Soviet Union, on the assumption that that would ultimately be to the United States' advantage. Got a lot of other war stories, but let me stop there.
Thank you, Tom.